Joining us again from New Delhi, India, is Dr. Jagannath Panda. Dr. Panda is a research fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses in New Delhi. He is a leading authority on China and the Indo-Pacific security studies with a prime focus on East Asian affairs. Dr. Panda is the author of the book, India-China Relations, Politics of Resources, Identity, and Authority in a Multipolar World Order, as well as the book, China's Path to Power, Party, Military, and the Politics of State Transition. Follow Dr. Panda on Twitter at JPPJAGANNATH1. I'm going to repeat that. It's a mouthful, but it's an important Twitter account. You need to read it. At JPPJAGANNATH1. Dr. Panda's Twitter feed is full of timely updates on the latest geopolitical and security news involving India, China, Japan, and the broader Indo-Pacific. We have Dr. Panda here to explain India's important role on the international stage. Dr. Panda, it's great to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Gover. It's a pleasure to come back to your podcast.
So we know that over the past year, it's been a rocky time for India-China relations, with China's incursions into Indian territory, China's illegal occupation of Nepal's territory as well, and a deadly Chinese-led brawl in the Galwan River. This added significant tensions in an already difficult relationship, resulting in Indian boycotts of Chinese-made mobile phone apps like TikTok, as well as the banning of China's most well-known telecommunications company, Huawei. I read your excellent piece last week for the Stimson Center, in which you describe how this has led to New Delhi and Beijing disengaging and India opting to strengthen its economic and security ties with its Quad partners. Amid this backdrop, Dr. Panda, what is the latest with New Delhi's relations with Beijing? Will these standoffs in the Himalayan areas continue? And I ask because it seems like China's attempting to change the status quo of the border areas.
Well, thank you. Let me answer your questions going back a little to the history. If we see from 1960 onwards, China has always been a concern to India's national security. But what has really become apparent today and clear is that it has emerged as a security threat number one to India and many countries in the world. And I think that's the defining element out here, that we do see a resilient, a more revisionist, and more assertive China under the leadership of Xi Jinping. And particularly when we are dealing with a nationalist China, when the Communist Party of China is at the verge of celebrating its 100 years just next month, 1st of July, then it becomes a serious concern for rest of the world, and to India, it's definitely a national security threat. Now, coming back to the on-ground situation, as you mentioned, there is a lot of disengagement talk is going on, and the process started some time back. In fact, it's been almost, nearly more than 6 months. We have started the disengagement process in the Eastern Ladakh region. Now, we need to find out that even though there was a diplomatic, virtual understanding and on-ground military understanding, and there was a political overture to disengage on the Eastern Ladakh from face to face and try to diffuse the tensions, why the disengagement has been so slow? Why the Chinese have not really been able to really withdraw from the regions? And how does it really impact the disengagement process? I think two factors needs to be noted. And I think this is what I mentioned in my piece at the Stimson Center in the Southeastern Voice. That if we see, I think there are two negations has arrived from both the sides. One is a negation on the boundary issue. The second is a kind of a national negation to acknowledge each other's prominence, each other's rights. And I think these two negations has been the defining element behind why the disengagement process has been quite slow. If I come to the first point, when it comes to the boundary issues, I think despite of there are a lot of mechanisms, MOUs, agreements, the things have not really been going well, because each and every time such kind of episodes are happening, when we are seeing a kind of a transgression from the Chinese side, or let's say intrusion from the Chinese side to the Indian territory, the Chinese are making a statement to change the status quo on the ground. So that means every time the Chinese are claiming with new grounds when it comes to the India-China boundary dispute. And that has actually created a context of negating the negotiation strategy. As you know, that the negotiation between India and China has been over-reliant on the special representative level dialogue, and also on the WMCC, that is the working mechanisms for consultation and coordination on border affairs. So through each of this incident, the Chinese are trying to make a context and make a new claim that all these negotiations mechanisms are still there, but we need to find effective mechanisms in order to address China's new claim. So there is a negation has emerged more from the Chinese side than the Indian side. The second point is that the national negotiation and the national negation towards each other. As I mentioned, that China has become a more assertive power under Xi Jinping's leadership. Communist Party is on the verge of celebrating its 100 years next month, and therefore they do not want to acknowledge an India under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, which foreign policy has also been rejuvenated to some extent. And if we see the India's post-pandemic foreign policy, it has been more based on a pointed alignment strategy in order to strengthen its ties with US, with Japan, with Australia, with a range of Indo-Pacific countries, and trying to question and raise, more public debates about China's actions plans and China's initiatives in the regions. And that has not really gone well with the Xi Jinping administration, particularly with the Communist Party, including the People's Liberation Army. When you try to understand from the Indian point of view, I think the current government in Delhi is really a nationalist government, and it is not really ready to succumb to any Chinese pressure and not ready to negotiate anything when it comes to India's national interest. So there is a national negation has arrived between India and China. And to that effect, China is also unable to acknowledge India's rights, India's prominence in the regions, and most importantly, India's nationalist thinking plan that Prime Minister Modi is coming to the table.
I'm wondering if you see any parallels between the dynamic you just described between China and India and their boundary dispute and China's activities in other areas of the Indo-Pacific. As we've observed over the past few years, China has its aircraft have intruded into Taiwan's airspace repeatedly. Its vessels have made a number of incursions into Japanese waters. It's claimed the entire South China Sea while sinking Vietnamese and Filipino vessels, while building also artificial islands for forward force projection. And then, of course, there's the crackdown in Hong Kong. You wrote that for Xi, the current geopolitical climate is an ideal opportunity for China to assert itself. Can you expand on this? And do you see parallels between what's happening in the broader region and China's and India's border disputes?
I think there is a clear linkages between the China-India boundary dispute and also the kind of action plan and assertiveness we see from the leadership of Xi Jinping in the region. Now, if we recall, I think if we take the text of Xi Jinping's speech in the last party congress and the previous party congress before that, in each of the party congress speech, Xi Jinping is continuously making a statement that national sovereignty and national security would not and never be compromised in China's political context and China's political history. And I think that has become a much more nationalist-oriented statement. And when we try to link it with Chinese Communist Party plan, and I think they have put a kind of a target for themselves, be it 2025, be it 2032, or be it 2049. In each of these target, the Communist Party of China has made a statement that China would return to that original historical glory, and China would like to establish itself as a middle kingdom power, being the top of the earth and being the number one country in the earth, challenging the supremacy of the United States. And I think that is something that we need to really take into account, and how China wants to achieve this. On the one hand, we do see that China's Belt and Road initiatives is a charm offensive economic employment strategy, keeping China's economic opportunities in the regions. On the other hand, when it comes to the maritime and the land domain, we do see a much more nationalist and assertive China through new claims. This is what we are seeing in the South China Sea regions, through artificial island buildings to continuous claiming of the new islands in the regions or new scarvos in the regions, and also trying to create divisions among the Southeast Asian countries, be it in the ASEAN forums or outside the ASEAN forums. And I think this is what the Chinese strategy is all about, that creating a division between the neighbors, and so that they can have a greater opportunities to reach to those countries through their economic means, through their economic diplomacies, and on the other hand, they would exert their assertiveness. So very briefly, if we see the China-India boundary context with the maritime disputes that China is having with the other countries in the regions, there is a clear linkages. In the South Asian regions, in the China-India boundary dispute, the Chinese have tried to create a division between India and Bhutan, India and Nepal, including a division between India and Bangladesh, keeping apart the original Chinese strategy to keep India and Pakistan stay divided onwards. Similarly, we do see a same kind of strategy outlook from the Chinese side in terms of keeping a division and divided all the Southeast Asian countries. And this is what we are seeing, that not all the claimant South China Sea claimant states in the Southeast Asian regions are united when it comes to China. They have their different voices. They have their own claiming points in the South China Sea. And that actually gives an array of opportunities to China to play the games and exert new claims on the maritime domain.
Shifting focus a bit, Dr. Panda, you are an astute observer of Japan. And Japan has a lot on its plate right now, although we're not exactly sure. It appears as if Japan is about to welcome many of the world's athletes for the Olympic Games in Tokyo that are scheduled to open next month. In addition to that, it's in the middle of a vaccination campaign against COVID. And it's contributing funds for a global COVID vaccine campaign. It also has, after the Olympics this fall, lower house elections. But in terms of its foreign and defense policy, sir, what are some of the things that are demanding the time of policymakers in Tokyo? What's on their minds each day in terms of their national security policy as we look at things going forward?
I think from where I do see, I think there has been a discontinuation in Japanese foreign policy in the post Shinzo Abe period. We know that for a fact that the former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, he was very active when it comes to Japan's foreign policy activism and security calculus, including the defense engagement and trying to revive the defense posture, military posture of Japan. And I think he had taken a lot of interest in terms of reviving the debate of Japan, reforming the age-old Japanese constitution, including Article 9. But I think all of this debate is currently witnessing a kind of it is in a way getting derailed, and also the Japanese are losing out the plot to the pandemic, to the Olympics, and to the political chaos that has actually arrived post Shinzo Abe. And if we see the current leadership in Tokyo currently, it's not really a united force. It's not really a consensual political voice that is, reflected in the Japanese foreign policy and security thinking. And I think, therefore, there is a clear dislinkage one can notice between the Abe period and the post-Abe period. Now, while saying that, I think the current administration in Tokyo and the current prime minister, that is Mr. Soga, he is under a lot of pressure. I think he has created a pressure for himself to take the political mileage, but at the same time, he has not really been able to tactically handle the pandemic, and also he has not really been effective in terms of taking a effective call on holding the Olympics. So I think holding the Olympics was a very risk-prone strategic call on the part of Suga, and he wanted to hold this Olympics, keeping his political fortune in Japan, which is not really being materialized to his benefit. And therefore, what we see is that Japan is again losing out its plot on the greater Indo-Pacific regions to provide the guidance and the leadership that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe used to provide. And therefore, what we are seeing that on the one hand, Japanese economy is struggling due to the pandemic, due to the national emergency, due to the lockdown. There is a not really urgency to go for the vaccination program. Only recently, the Japan has started the vaccination program, and I don't really see in next couple of months Japan really going forward so massively to vaccinate this big amount of people in Japan. So that will take time. And also the political climate in Japan is not really stable when it is facing the election. So I think all of this being reflected in its foreign policy. And today we are seeing that Japan losing out a much more concentrated and much more serious foreign policy approach towards the Indo-Pacific under Prime Minister Suga. And that's the defining element, and that's the differing point between Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Prime Minister Suga.
Fascinating. In terms of the Middle East, a question for you. In a few weeks' time, on June 18, Iran will hold a presidential election in which a hardline candidate, the country's judiciary chief, a fellow by the name of Ibrahim Raisi, is considered to be the favorite to win. Iran has been one of the largest suppliers of crude oil to India, although both countries have had differences over key foreign policy issues from time to time, but they have a long relationship of trade and commerce. What can you share with us about the state of India's relations with Iran today?
I think India does have a huge historical presence in the Middle East or West Asian regions, and Iran is a key partner to that effect. And I think if we go back to the history, we do see a civilization linkages between India and Iran, and that has been a defining point when we try to contextualize India-Iran relationship in a current and present context. But I think what has been most outstanding about, what has been most astounding about India-Iran relationship is that the geopolitical necessities of realizing each other's importance and still not allowing the third countries to affect India-Iran partnerships. Even though this partnership is not really very stable, not very strengthened one, but I think the uniqueness about India-Iran relationship is that it is not really disturbed by the third country elements in the regions. Now, there are a number of issues that we need to talk about when we are talking about India-Iran relationship. One is that I think Iran is one of those Islamic country in the Middle Eastern regions, with India enjoys a stable political ties in comparison to many other countries. And I think that is a plus point when we look from India's foreign policy point of view. The second element is that I think the economic necessity of India-Iran relationship is much larger. Iran needs India's consumer base to purchase oils and many other goods from the regions. At the same time, India also wants Iran as a partner in the Middle Eastern regions to make a presence in the regions, and also try to facilitate Iran as a medium country of channel to the greater West Asian or Middle Eastern regions, and having a linkages to the Central Asian regions. So, and Chahawar report is a glaring example to that effect. So there is a connections of a multimodal connectivity that has arrived between India and Iran. And this is a strategic necessity that binds India-Iran relationship to a greater extent. There is a need for maritime connectivity. There is a need for more digital connectivity with Iran, and also in terms of having a more political contacts between India and Iran, not to allow the third countries to affect the relationship. We know for a fact that China is a big actor in Iran today, and but if we try to understand, despite of Iran showing a positive inclination towards China, and Iran-China relationship growing from year to year on basis on many issues, still the China factor has not really been a barrier between India and Iran. In fact, if we see calculatively, there has been a talk that China is trying to subdue some of the projects that India and Iran are, trying to promote, including the Chabahar port. But that is not really actually the case. Chinese investment in most of the Iranian ports are still there, and in fact, these investments are always there, not only in Iran but many of the many of the Middle Eastern countries. So I think India needs to take a clear view and understanding of the fact that China as a third country has little to do with between India and Iran. At the same time, I think Iranians have also realized that India is certainly a country that should not be discarded for the sake of Iran's engagement with China. And I think there is a mutual reciprocation that is driving India-Iran relationship. More than that, I think the greater geopolitical aspects of Iran and the US dynamics also comes in between. We know for a fact that India and US are strategic partner, and India would, in principle, support the Americans' initiatives with regard to, on the nuclear issues in the Iran. But I think India is the country which has not really, if we try to see it skeptically, India and the US has not been on the same board when it comes to the Iranian issue, Iranian nuclear issue. So I think that also explains the maturity in India-Iran relationship, that India takes a more practical and more on-ground call when it comes to its relationship with Iran, and not entirely be influenced by the US factor. So the third factor element, be it US, be it China, has its own limitations when it comes to India-Iran partnership and relationship. And I think that is one of those most impressive hallmarks of this partnership. And I think both India and Iran realizes this, and they would like to continue to the next decade in shaping the India-Iran bilateral relationship.
Couple of COVID-related questions for you, Dr. Panda. We've read in the news about the terrible suffering associated with India's second wave of COVID-19. Where do things stand today with the pandemic, and which regions of the country are most affected by COVID?
I think if we see a holistic picture, the entire India has been struggling with COVID. And not to mention that, this virus does not know the doesn't really limit itself to any particular boundary. So saying that in a country like India, where it's a densely populated country, it is very difficult to restrict the pandemic. But what we see is that I think the pandemic has been severe in the capital city, New Delhi. And I think the entire Delhi region has been hugely affected, and that has been enormous and having its own lasting impact throughout the India. But we have seen that in comparison to Delhi, I think the regions like Maharashtra, Mumbai, which has been a commercial capital of India, has been badly hit by the pandemic. Now today we see the most part of the Western India, be it Punjab, be it Rajasthan, be it Maharashtra, be it Gujarat, it has been hugely impacted by the COVID-19. Today we do see a rising trend in the southern India. Southern India's where in fact noticed to have new variants. So that's a worrisome factor. So indeed, it is very hard to see a uniform pattern in India. But yes, in relative proportion, I think what we see is that the northeastern part of India and the northern part of India has not really been terribly affected by the pandemic, by COVID-19, and that's a welcome news as far as India's governance strategy is concerned. But I think yes, if we try to see holistically, India has been quite dearly affected by the pandemic, and I think it's high time we should have built a good health infrastructure over the last 1 year. And I think to that effect, we were not really prepared to face this pandemic. And there has been some loopholes on the part of the governance strategy to address the pandemic.
We've heard about the shortage of medical oxygen, and we know that international aid has been delivered. To your knowledge, do healthcare facilities in India now have enough oxygen supplies and hospital beds? Have-
I think we have to see in an Indian context. We are having a federal system, and in a federal system, there is always a division of opinion, division of outlook, division of strategy between the central government and the state government. And it is difficult to have a uniform voice. But when it comes to addressing the pandemic, what we need to understand is that probably what India was not really prepared or mishandled the pandemic to addressing in terms of providing the adequate health infrastructure that was required, not only in the urban areas but on the rural areas. And what we need to take into account that there was always a huge gap between urban infrastructure and rural infrastructure in India. And the pandemic was such that there was always a difficult scenario to provide enough oxygen, to provide enough vaccine, to provide enough beds and health infrastructure, including the facilities of providing medicines, drugs, and doctors. And I think to that effect, there was a lack of coordination between the central government and the state government. So they were not on a uniform ground. But while saying that, I think in a country like India, when it is a densely populated country and very soon will be crossing China to emerge as the #1 populous country in the world, I think it was a much needed foresight to have this health infrastructure ready a year back. And I think it was a purely negligence and purely misgovernance strategy on the part of whole India, not only on the part of the central government, but also on the part of the state government. There was a need for a united voice, united strategy. More importantly, India wanted a more united national strategy to deal with the pandemic in terms of providing oxygen, in terms of going for more vaccination programs, more intense testing programs, and providing more hospital beds, health infrastructures, and to have more consultation with the doctors. That was not really prepared. That was not really provided. Hence, there is a huge consequences India as a country is facing today.
Now, the Biden administration committed to providing COVID aid to India, mostly in terms of raw materials for vaccines, oxygen equipment, PPE, and various medical supplies. Does New Delhi think that the White House's response was adequate? Was there any disappointment?
I think it was expected, and the way the Americans' new administration and Biden has responded to the to providing, oxygen to drugs to vaccine to India at a time of dire situation, and I think this is a welcome initiative, and India appreciate. And I think on record, both the Indian government and the strategic communities in India has responded to these U.S. overtures, which has been quite supportive. And I think always there is a huge expectations from India to receive probably more help from US as a bigger partner, as a greater economy, and as a much more stronger partner in the regions. And I think that expectation is not necessarily a negative expectations or should not be viewed negatively. And I think these expectations only defines to the point that how India-US relationship is becoming more interdependent, and the kind of political maturity and strategic maturities are emerging uh, between the between the people constituency in both the countries. And to that effect, I think India has welcomed Biden administration's initiatives and the assistance in terms of providing necessary amenities, necessary health equipments to facilitate to deal with the pandemic in India. And I think that is a welcome development in India-US partnership, which would be reflected in terms of taking forward the India-US partnership to the regional level and strengthening and try to give it a much more broader regional outlook in terms of translating this partnership in terms of health governance, in terms of addressing the non-traditional security threats in the Indo-Pacific regions. And I think this pandemic has been a wake-up call, not only for India, for many countries in the world. And I think to that effect, India-US partnership is solidifying their relationship to make a statement that partnership of this nature can be the defining element of the Indo-Pacific partnership. And this is what we are going to see probably in coming times. The way the Indian foreign minister went to US to discuss about the pandemic, about how to strengthen the India-US relationship on the health governance issues, and trying to have a more bilateral partnership which will complement the Indo-Pacific narrative. That's really astounding, and that's a welcome development as far as India-US relations is concerned.
Amid the recent COVID difficulties in India, has support for the ruling BJP party been affected? And what is Prime Minister Modi standing with the voters right now?
I think definitely pandemic of this nature will always bring a range of opportunities and range of challenges for any government. So to this effect, I think uh, this pandemic has brought a lot of challenges for the Modi administration than opportunities. And I think when you are a densely populated country, obviously the onus lies on the central government when the pandemic has taken a huge turn to affect, to result in loss of life, loss of life to deal with, severe health crisis. So to that effect, I think the central government is facing a huge challenge to tackle the pandemic. And there has been a lot of debate about how the central government has challenged the pandemic, addressed the pandemic, and how Prime Minister Modi's leadership is really visible to this effect. So there will always be a question mark about his governance style when it comes to addressing this pandemic and its severe consequences. But I think if we take into account the previous experiences, how Prime Minister Modi has addressed the other severe governance issues in India, he has come back very hard, and he has addressed the situation much more effectively. And so one expects, I think, Prime Minister Modi will come back strongly in terms of addressing the situation. And this is currently being reflected in its current approach over the last 3 to 4 weeks, particularly when the government machinery, the central government administration has become much more responsible in its approach in terms of handling the pandemic, in terms of addressing the health infrastructure issues and its governance issues relates to the health, and more importantly, in terms of generating more vaccines. So the vaccination program in India has taken a much more faster and much more urgent mode of scales in terms of vaccinating the older generation to the middle-aged persons to the youth generation. And I think this is what being reflected in Prime Minister Modi's leadership at this moment.
How has India's economy coped amid COVID-19? Which sectors have been hit the hardest and which sectors have been the most resilient?
I think if we see, I think it's probably all the sectors have been severely affected. But I think if we see in India's context, it is an agricultural based economy. And to that effect, the farmers, the daily wagers, the shopkeepers, the economy which is much more market oriented and becoming market oriented, all of these sectors have been severely affected. So if we talk about the pandemic, I think we see the farmer protest coming from the western part of India, particularly from Punjab and Haryana, and adding to this pandemic, the agricultural sector has been hugely affected. And more than that, I think the grassroots cottage industries and the daily wage laborers, the small scale industrial sectors have been hugely affected. We know that the global economy is at the recession, and we know for a fact that many bigger economies in the world is facing the challenges and going for a recession, and India is no different to that effect. But if we see in particular context of India, I think it is the labor class, is the daily wagers and the farmers, and their sectors has been hugely impacted by this pandemic.
Next month, we will reach the 6-month mark of the Biden presidency. In this 6-month mark, what are some of the pressing issues facing the India-US relationship?
I think we know that every administration, every government comes to power, there will always be a reassessment of any relationship or approach to a particular country. So to that effect, I think the Biden administration is still trying to understand and still trying to figure it out how a relationship with India can be strengthened or shaped further. And to that effect, I think the the recently concluded visit of Indian Foreign Minister to Washington, D.C., Dr. Jaisankar's visit to US was a significant development, and it allowed the Indian Foreign Minister and the Modi administration to stay engaged with the Biden administration to talk about some of the issues that India and US needs to take forward and also to address in future in terms of challenges. Now, to take it forward, I think India-US defense and security partnership is one aspect of the relationship which needs to be taken forward. And I think both the sides have signed the 4 foundational, defense security agreements. And I think that's a basis to strengthen the India-US defense and security partnership. The need of the hour is how to execute some of these agreements and take the security and defense partnership forward, having more of an Indo-Pacific undercurrents attached to it. And to that effect, we need to have more purchasing of high-tech technologies from the US. India would expect that. And I think there the US administration, the Biden administration, need to be a clear-cut approach towards India in terms of responding to India's needs and requirements. The second thing is that I think when it comes to the economic governance approach or strengthening the economic partnership between India and US, I think India's expectation from the US would be how to strengthen the partnership in terms of bilateral economic partnership, free trade agreements, and also more importantly to strengthen in areas like infrastructure and connectivity. And I think there will be a huge expectation from the Biden administration to translate the India-US economic partnership into a regional economic partnership, strengthening the infrastructure and the connectivity initiatives. And there, Biden administration would like to see how India is responding to US calls on blue dot networks, on quality infrastructure programs, whether India would really like to join in some of the initiatives like blue dot networks, which is being promoted by US, Japan, and Australia. So I think there will be expectations and challenges coming up. And to that effect, a range of issues needs to be discussed between Biden administration and Modi administration. More than that, I think the China challenge will continue to remain a backgrounder for India-US partnership. And to what effect both the Biden administration and Modi administration can come to a common ground in terms of balancing and possibly countering some of the Chinese initiatives in the regions needs to be seen. For example, supply chain resilience initiative is one of those initiatives that India is promoting with Japan and Australia. Can US become a part of it? Even though between India and US, even though between the Quad countries, the supply chain resilience initiative is being discussed, US as a partner, but I think so far US has not, as a partner, has not really figured in the ACRI framework among India, Japan, and Australia. And to that effect, I think there is a lot to discuss with the new Biden administration. And it needs to be seen how supply chain resilience initiatives can act as a counterbalancing initiatives to China's Belt and Road initiatives, to China's unilateral approach towards the regions. And to that effect, I think China factor would continue to emerge as a backgrounder in India-US relationship, and it will pose serious and continuous challenge not only for the Biden administration, not only for the Modi administration, but also for the India-US partnership in times to come.
Fascinating analysis, sir. So to wrap things up, a few last questions. Can you recommend any recent article or podcast about India for our audience?
I think you can read some of the stuffs written by Dr. Sanjay Baru, who is a political economist and geopolitical strategist. He's Bharat Professor, a journalist scholar. He has written a lot on the subject. So Dr. Sanjay Baru's writings is easily available in the media. So one can read all of the stuffs. And also, I would strongly recommend possibly to read some of the write-ups coming up from Dr. Brahmachelani. Even though he is critical about some of the India's governance approaches, but it's worth reading some of his views to get an alternative perspectives, including some of the write-ups by Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who has been outstanding on some of the issues that how India should be responding to the current challenges, to the pandemic, how India should look at the future. And I think some of these write-ups should be read out to get an alternative perspective, a critical perspective that India needs to probably thought about in terms of to have a better governance strategy and to deal with the pandemic and its future foreign policy issues.
So many of us are still working from home and we're spending more time in our homes than we're accustomed to. And that allows us some time to watch movies, documentaries. Do you know of a good movie or documentary about India for Americans to watch? Or if not, do you know of a good Bollywood film that you would recommend?
Oh, a lot of movies. I must say that when it comes to movies, so frequently I watch some of these documentaries movies that I tend to probably forget the names and the actors. And as you know, India is a society of multicultural and multi-ethnic, and there are so many Bollywood movies as well as regional movies. And I am also a big fan of regional movies,
Mm.
including my hometown movies, that is Oriya movies, well documented, documentaries and movies made by Oriya filmmakers. So I would not be able to recommend a particular movie or actor. That would be probably unfair. But yes, I think Indian movies are very popular. It has its own soft power connotations. It's easily available in most of the good networks and subscriber list. One can one can easily see this. But coming back to the entertainment aspect, I think I'm a big fan of listening to the music.
Yeah.
Even though I'm a big fan of Hollywood music and Western singers, particularly, Engelbert, then, Kenny G, then probably, there are many others who are really my favorites, but I would also a big listener to Indian music like Kishore Kumar and Mohammad Rafi, including Ghazals by Jagjit Singh. So I would recommend the American authors to hear some of the Indian musics. And both Mohammad Rafi and Kishore Kumar, they are uh, they are the world singers, classical singers. So probably their songs will give a picture of how India was romantic in old times.
Yeah.
And Jagjit Singh is a contemporary, much more contemporary singer. He reads. He actually sings, classical songs. He recently passed away, but he is a ghazal singer.
Mm.
And anybody who's interested on Jagjit Singh's ghazal, I would recommend that. And he's a very popular singer. I'm not really a big fan of the contemporary new style Indian musicians. I'm an old fashioned person to some extent. So therefore, I would recommend Indian classical music by Kishore Kumar and Mohammad Rafi.
Excellent. Well, like others, I've been um, stuck at home, and I saw recently a wonderful Punjabi film. It was called Tere Naal Love Ho Gaya. And I don't know if you've seen it, but if you ever have some extra time, I think you'd enjoy it. It's a lovely film. Um, okay. Last question about, I guess, Indian culture. Do you have a favorite type of biryani?
Yes, I love biryani, but not a big fan. Once in a while, I love, but yeah, I think what I have done all of this the while is to focus most on my research writings and all. And I think that has been one of the key aspects of staying busy while not being affected by the pandemic. So I have just tried myself not to get disturbed by the pandemic. I myself was a victim of the COVID infection 4 weeks back.
Mm,
And I recovered, thankfully. So
good.
I know how this virus can affect your body, your mind, your psychological thing. But again, I think the best thing one can do is to stay at home, and maintain as much as possible hygienic practice, and concentrate on your own profession. And my profession is such that you don't need a big biryani style going to to have your fondly biryani to external restaurant. You can prepare it at home,
Yeah.
so your desktop, you can glue to your internet, to your subscribing magazines, news portal, and keep on writing, reading, and debate those issues. Sometimes you might come out with a good piece, sometimes you might not really come out with a good piece. But I think my profession demands that you take it forward to the next level, whatever points and debates you have, and let the public, the strategic community, to debate it out and read your paper, and stay engaged in the public domain. And this is what I have been doing for last nearly 1.5 years, to keep myself busy and focused, read and write as much as possible, and try to take the debates on Indo-Pacific, to India-China, to India-Japan, to the pandemic politics that the world is currently living with.
Well, thank God your condition has improved and that you're doing okay. That's what's most important. And your writings over the past year have just been incredible. I've learned a lot from them. And as far as biryani is concerned, I really can't stop thinking about it. I look forward to visiting India once travel opens up to have more of that wonderful dish. So, last question for you, Dr. Panda. You've been so generous with your time. What projects are you currently working on? Do you have any plans in the work for maybe a new article, a new book?
I'm currently focusing on 3, 4 issues specifically. One is I'm focusing on the future of India-China relations in Indo-Pacific, and my book would be coming sometimes next year, which is on the verge of finalization. The book is about how India is responding to China in Indo-Pacific through its pointed alignment strategy. The next big issue that I'm focusing and doing is on Quad Plus. Quad and Quad Plus are my primary focus areas.
Mhm.
And if you see my write-ups over the last 1.5 decade, last and 1.5 year, I'm writing continuously on Quad and Quad Plus. In fact, Quad Plus debate, I did a special issue on the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, and it is publicly available. And a edited volume length on Quad Plus would be arriving sometimes towards the end of this year. I'm also focusing on the supply chain resilience initiatives a lot,
Mm.
having a much more serious partnership between India and Japan, India and Australia, and how US can be a partner with India, US, and Japan, with India, Australia, and Japan. So I think some of these areas are my prime focused. Yes, very shortly, India-China relations, India-Japan relations, Quad Plus, supply chain resilience initiatives, and all the critical bilateral relationship among the Quad countries and Indo-Pacific powers, particularly India's relationship with India, Japan, India, Australia, India, US are my prime focus. And I'm coming out with some good papers in coming times. In fact, today, there will be an article coming in the Asia Global Online on supply chain resilience initiative and BRI, and whether the supply chain resilience initiatives among India, Australia, and Japan would eventually result in decoupling from China or not. I would recommend to have a read through this article, which will be coming later today in the Asia Global Online of the University of Hong Kong. Thank you.
Well, I look forward to reading that article, and I look forward to all these forthcoming projects of yours. This is very exciting. Our guest today has been Dr. Jagannath Panda of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis in New Delhi, India. Dr. Panda, thank you for helping us to understand these dynamics better. We're appreciative of you taking the time. Please take care of yourself. It's been great to see you again, and we'll check in back with you soon.
Thank you, Mr. Grover. It's a pleasure talking to you. You have a good day, good week ahead. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.